In the brutal theater of medieval politics, there are executions, and then there are spectacles of annihilation. What happened to Hugh Despenser the Younger in November of 1326 was not just a death, it was a message, a grotesque opera of vengeance, humiliation, and public ritual designed to tear apart not only a man, but an entire legacy of power. Imagine the screams echoing through the streets of Hereford, and executioners with chilling precision dismantled Despenser's body piece by piece, not in haste but with ceremony, and not for justice but for impact. His genitals cut and tossed into flames, his entrails drawn while he still lived, his limbs scattered across the kingdom. It was horror as theater, pain as policy. But why? Why did this man, born into noble blood, end up in one of the most savage executions in English history? Because Hugh Despenser wasn't just a traitor, he was the king's favorite, the man behind the throne, the whisper in Edward II's ear, the rumored lover who ruled in shadows and dared to challenge the entire structure of medieval aristocracy. And in doing so, he made enemies of everyone, from barons to bishops, from the commoners he starved to the queen he tried to silence. And when Queen Isabella finally rose to strike, she didn't just aim to defeat him, she wanted to erase him. This wasn't just a power struggle, it was a war of symbols, about masculinity, monarchy, and the limits of loyalty. Despenser's execution wasn't merely punishment, it was a performance meant to unmake him, body and soul, before a cheering crowd thirsty for blood and closure. As we peel back the centuries, we'll uncover how one man went from minor noble to shadow monarch, and how unchecked ambition, sexual scandal, and ruthless politics turned him into the most hated man in England. The path to the scaffold didn't begin in chains. It began with access to a fragile king and a throne too easily controlled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born not into greatness, but into proximity. Proximity to privilege, to palace walls, to whispers of strategy and ambition. The Despensers were not England's most illustrious family, but they were sharp, cunning, and ruthlessly loyal to the crown when it served them. Hugh inherited his father's name and his appetite for dominance, but he would far surpass his father in scale and in audacity. When Edward died in 1307, the English throne passed to his son Edward II, a king ill-suited for the brutal necessities of rule. Where his father was a warrior king, Edward II was contemplative, bookish, and most scandalously, devoted to men who did not belong in council chambers. His first infamous favorite, Piers Gaveston, dazzled the king with wit and beauty, but enraged the nobility with arrogance and open displays of power. The barons struck back. Gaveston was seized and executed in 1312. The throne was left weakened, blood-stained, and vacant for another confidant. That's where Hugh Despenser stepped in. Unlike Gaveston, Despenser wasn't a flamboyant outsider. He was English through and through, with bluff-bardians in a face the nobility couldn't easily dismiss. But he played a longer game. He didn't just seek the king's affection, he sought his function. Despenser understood something Gaveston never did. True power doesn't parade itself. It embeds itself inside law, inside finance, inside the very machinery of monarchy. By 1318, Despenser had maneuvered his way into Edward II's inner circle, earning the title of Chamberlain. It wasn't a flashy title, but it was lethal in its access. As Chamberlain, Despenser controlled who spoke to the king, what messages reached him, what orders were signed. The crown still sat on Edward's head, but the hands that held it steady were Despenser's. And the transformation was immediate. Despenser began consolidating power with terrifying efficiency. He used his position to orchestrate the removal of rivals, manipulate court decisions, and engineer disputes that would end in forfeited lands, all funneled not into royal coffers, but into his own pockets. He wasn't simply accumulating wealth. He was building a kingdom within a kingdom. But his ascent didn't go unnoticed. Nobles whispered, bishops frowned, and Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife, began to burn with quiet resentment. She watched as her influence waned, her household budget was slashed, and her husband's loyalty drifted into the arms of another man. Despenser made no effort to conceal his disdain for her. She was merely a political inconvenience, an ornament to monarchy, nothing more. This was more than a political rivalry. It was a personal war in slow motion, and Despenser, he thrived on it. By 1322, foreign ambassadors were reporting that audiences with the king were pointless unless Despenser was present, and that real negotiations occurred only behind closed doors with the favorite. Edward II, it seemed, had become a figurehead. The real monarch was unelected, unloved, and named Hugh. With every year, Despenser's methods grew bolder and darker. He engineered the downfall of Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom and a royal cousin, ensuring his capture and execution in March 1322. It was a political masterstroke and a warning: blood ties wouldn't save you. Oppose the favorite, and you'd find yourself dead, dispossessed, or disgraced. From the Welsh marches, Despenser carved out personal territories like a robber baron cloaked in royal robes. These frontier lands were historically governed by semi-autonomous lords. But Despenser saw opportunity. He manipulated legal loopholes, incited conflicts, and swooped in as self-appointed savior, only to keep the lands for himself. He didn't just rob, he legitimized his robberies. Despenser's genius wasn't brutality, it was bureaucratic brutality. He rewrote laws, repopulated courts with loyalists, and created a paper trail of royal decrees that masked theft as administration. His enemies couldn't fight him in the streets because on parchment, he was untouchable. And as he grew in power, so too did the fury of those he humiliated. Among the nobility, hatred festered. Among the people, fear ruled. And within the palace, Queen Isabella, now exiled from her husband's council, began to plot in silence. But Despenser, intoxicated with control, didn't see it. Not yet. Because in his mind, the kingdom was no longer England. It was a chessboard, and he, the unseen player, moving kings and queens as he pleased. Despenser's power no longer required subtlety. What began as political maneuvering had hardened into rule by intimidation. With the crown in his grasp and the king under his thumb, Hugh Despenser operated not as an advisor, but as a sovereign predator. He governed through fear, cloaked in the language of law. His enemies weren't merely defeated, they were disassembled. Nobles who dared to resist found their titles stripped, their families imprisoned, their estates confiscated through legal sleight of hand. A feud with Despenser didn't end with exile, it ended with ruin, and no region bore the brunt more than the Welsh marches. These borderlands, once protected by semi-independent lords, became Despenser's hunting ground. He manipulated ancient feudal codes, instigated conflicts, and used royal decrees as weapons to seize castles, lands, and loyalty. By the mid-1320s, Despenser's holdings rivaled that of the crown itself. It was empire building by another name, and it came at a cost. Behind closed doors, nobles whispered of his tyranny, but in public they bowed. The price of defiance was simply too high. Despenser's reach extended through the courts, the treasury, even the church. His informants sat in parliaments and parish halls alike. Dissent became a death sentence. Allegiance was survival. Even the clergy were not spared. When Bishop Adam Orleton criticized royal policy, Despenser had him imprisoned and tortured, an act so shocking that even those who had tolerated his abuses began to question the direction of England. Despenser's cruelty knew no hierarchy, no sanctity. Women, nobles, and holy men all became tools or targets. But when he abducted Lady Alice de Lacy, one of the wealthiest women in England, and took control of her estates under the guise of protection, it wasn't just a scandal, it was sacrilege. Even in medieval England, there were lines you weren't meant to cross. Despenser obliterated them all. What made his reign terrifying wasn't just the brutality, it was the normalization of brutality. He didn't act like a tyrant in public. He wrote letters, held trials, signed documents. His violence came wrapped in seals and scrolls, delivered by clerks in royal livery. It was official, legal, inevitable. That was his genius. He made injustice feel like due process. And so, the realm fell into a quiet nightmare. Villages whispered of disappearances, noble houses extinguished overnight, political marriages rearranged like chess pieces, entire bloodlines wiped out through carefully constructed accusations of treason, each justified by paperwork. No one knew who would fall next. The court became a cage, and Despenser held the key. Yet even as his terror network expanded, so too did resistance. Quiet at first, then coalescing. Displaced lords fled into exile. Queen Isabella, stripped of influence and financial resources, began making contact with the outcasts. Her correspondence with Roger Mortimer, a Marcher lord turned renegade, became the heart of a movement. But inside England, open rebellion remained unthinkable, because Despenser had reshaped reality. He had turned fear into law, and law into fear. People no longer trusted neighbors. Servants betrayed masters. Clergy feared confession. It was a society devouring itself from within, held together not by faith in the king, but terror of the favorite. He even weaponized shame. Public trials didn't just punish, they humiliated. Aristocrats were paraded, their crimes read aloud, their lineage mocked. Their wives and daughters became pawns, married off, imprisoned, or reduced to bargaining chips. It was personal, intimate, calculated. And still, the king remained silent. Edward II, so utterly enmeshed in Despenser's orbit, had become a ghost in his own palace. Whether blinded by loyalty, affection, or fear, he allowed his favorite to run the kingdom like a private vendetta machine. Historians debate whether Edward was complicit or merely weak, but in the eyes of the people, the verdict was clear. The king had abandoned them. By 1325, the kingdom was suffocating. Every letter carried risk. Every guest could be a spy. England had not seen war, but it felt like occupation. The spiral of silence began to fracture. Isabella's exile gave her freedom and distance from Despenser's surveillance. While abroad in France, she wove a network of rebellion, calling upon disinherited nobles, foreign allies, and survivors of Despenser's wrath. They answered not just for politics, but for revenge. Back in England, the signs were subtle, but ominous. Merchants began withholding taxes. Local lords delayed sending troops. Whispers of Queen's men emerged in taverns. Despenser doubled down, demanding harsher penalties, faster seizures, more executions. But repression only fueled resolve. What Despenser failed to see was this. His control was no longer absolute. It was fragile, glass masquerading as iron. And the moment Isabella landed back in England, it would shatter. The autumn of 1326 didn't feel like war. It felt like release. When Queen Isabella's fleet landed on the shores of Essex, there were no armies waiting, no resistance, no royal fanfare from Edward II. Instead, England exhaled. After years of suffocating under Despenser's reign of silence and fear, the very air shifted. Commoners opened their gates. Nobles switched their allegiances overnight. It was as if an entire nation had been holding its breath, waiting for this one moment. Isabella's arrival was not framed as a coup, but a deliverance. She came draped not in armor, but in narrative. The wronged wife, the silenced queen, the mother of England's future. By her side stood Roger Mortimer, once hunted by Despenser, now returned as a rebel prince. Together, they marched under a banner that promised restoration, not revolution, and the people believed it. Edward II, caught off guard and paralyzed by indecision, turned to the only ally he had left, Hugh Despenser the Younger. They fled westward, toward the Welsh marches, hoping to find safety among the last remnants of Despenser's personal fiefdom. But that fiefdom had crumbled. The very men Despenser had elevated, enriched, and threatened now calculated their odds and chose survival. Castles that once swore loyalty slammed their gates shut. Towns that once paid tribute offered no food, no shelter, only silence. The empire Despenser built on fear was collapsing under the weight of opportunity. As Isabella's army closed in, their march wasn't marked by battle cries, but by welcomes. Whole garrisons defected. Clergy offered blessings. Merchants donated supplies. The queen, once a figurehead in her husband's court, now led a tide that could not be stemmed. The King of England was no longer ruling. He was running, and his favorite was no longer feared, but hunted. On October 27, 1326, Bristol Castle fell. Hugh Despenser the Elder, father to the infamous favorite and a power broker in his own right, was captured by Isabella's forces. His execution was swift and brutal, hanged, drawn, and quartered. his head displayed on London Bridge like a prize. But the real target remained at large. For weeks, Edward and the younger Despenser lived as fugitives, hiding in abbeys, riding through forests, trying to buy loyalty that no longer existed. Despenser, once clad in silk and gold, now cloaked himself in fear. He reportedly tried to starve himself, to disfigure his face, to disappear into anonymity. But history would not let him vanish. On November 16th, near Llantrisant in South Wales, they were caught. Betrayed by locals who saw no value in shielding the remnants of a regime everyone now cursed, the king and his favorite were handed over to Isabella's forces. Edward, though humiliated, was still a king. He would be deposed, not destroyed, at least not yet. But Hugh Despenser was another matter. He was the villain in every nobleman's tale, the corrupter of the crown, the architect of a decade of humiliation and bloodshed. There would be no mercy. There would be no trial. He was not brought to justice. He was brought to theater. His arrival in Hereford was choreographed like a royal procession in reverse. Crowds lined the streets not to celebrate him, but to consume his downfall. He was jeered, spat on, paraded in chains. The man who once controlled access to the king could now barely walk. Emaciated, trembling, stripped of dignity and protection, he became a living canvas for the nation's revenge. Despenser's fate was sealed, but his execution would not be swift. It would be crafted. Every gesture, every wound, every public act was designed not to kill him, but to unmake him. Before the scaffold was built, his crimes were read aloud, an endless list of betrayals, blasphemies, and perversions, treason, theft, corruption, and the unspoken but heavily insinuated sin, his unnatural closeness with the king. The crowds didn't need explanations. They had suffered. They had waited. Now they wanted to see the pain. By November 24, 1326, the pieces were in place. The queen had reclaimed the narrative. The people had found a scapegoat, and the crown, though not yet abdicated, was already changing hands. There was no courtroom, no defense, no chance for Hugh Despenser to explain, deny, or plead. His trial was not a legal proceeding, it was a liturgy of vengeance. The charges against him were ceremonial, almost poetic in their listing. High treason, theft, corruption, sacrilege, the corruption of the king's natural affections. The crowd didn't come for law. They came for spectacle. They were not disappointed. On November 24, 1326, the city of Hereford awoke to a different kind of dawn. Streets swelled with citizens who had traveled for days. Vendors sold bread and ale. Children climbed onto barrels for a better view. There was an air of celebration, but with the edge of violence. This was not a public punishment. It was a national exorcism. Despenser was dragged through the streets tied to a horse, his body scraping against the stones. Onlookers hurled refuse and curses, verses mocking his rumored intimacy with Edward II, lines sharpened by years of resentment. He had once silenced nobles. Now even peasants were allowed to scream. By the time he reached the scaffold, his body was battered, clothes torn, dignity gone. But the show was only beginning. This was not simply death, it was destruction. Ritualized, scripted, engineered to make a point so violent, so unforgettable that England would tremble at the memory for centuries. First came the hanging, not to death, but to the brink of it. The rope pulled tight, Despenser's legs kicked and twitched, but the executioners had trained for this. They knew the precise moment to cut him down, keeping him alive, disoriented and gasping. The crowd roared at the spectacle of pain. Then came the most shocking act. He was castrated in front of the masses, his genitals tossed into a fire. A symbolic severing of his alleged unnatural bond with the king, a calculated humiliation not just of the body, but of the legacy. It was vengeance soaked in sexual shame, fueled by medieval perceptions of masculinity and political deviance. Next, his abdomen was sliced open, his entrails pulled from his stomach, inch by inch as he writhed in agony. Chroniclers noted he was still alive, possibly conscious. His heart was cut out and thrown into the same flames. Every organ fed the fire like it might somehow purify the state. His body was now just an instrument of message. His limbs were tied to horses and torn from his torso. The remains were distributed, London, York, Bristol, Dover, as a grisly map of terror. His head was placed on a pike atop London Bridge, side by side with his father's. And with that, the name Hugh Despenser, the most powerful man in England, was erased with surgical savagery. This execution was unlike anything England had ever seen. It wasn't about justice, it was about memory, a trauma inflicted so deliberately, so theatrically, that it would embed itself in the psyche of the realm. For centuries, nobles whispered his name not in scorn, but in fear. This was the cautionary tale for any who dreamed too loudly in the ear of a king, building tension, victory, or violence. But as the flames died down, a new unease set in. If the favorite could be destroyed like this, who might be next? What had they really witnessed, justice, or something darker dressed in righteousness? For Queen Isabella, Despenser's death was both personal closure and political masterstroke. She had returned from exile, overthrown a king, and orchestrated the most brutal execution in English history without drawing her own sword. But her ascent wasn't finished. The king still breathed. The throne still awaited a new occupant. And England, while jubilant, had now tasted vengeance on a public stage. That appetite would not be easily forgotten. The body of Hugh Despenser had been quartered, burned, scattered, but his execution was far from the end. In many ways, it was just the beginning. News of his death swept through England like a thunderclap. In Hereford, the people sang into the night. In London, broadsheets and ballads mocked his demise with grotesque joy. The streets buzzed with a collective sigh of vengeance fulfilled, as if the execution had cleansed a national wound. But beneath the celebration, politics stirred. Within weeks of Despenser's death, Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne. The once king, now a ghost in his own realm, was dethroned not with swords, but with silence. His son, just 14, was crowned Edward III, a symbol of hope carefully managed by the regency of Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. It was a coup wrapped in the robes of restoration. Despenser's lands, vast, fertile, and strategically placed, were swiftly redistributed. Families he had ruined were suddenly lifted back into power. Long-forgotten alliances were resurrected. Those who had once whispered behind closed doors now toasted openly, reclaiming their status as if waking from a long national nightmare. But power once tasted rarely recedes. Isabella and Mortimer did not step aside. They ruled as de facto sovereigns, consolidating authority, manipulating court appointments, and wielding the same political machinery that Despenser had once mastered. To many, the faces had changed, but the system remained hauntingly familiar. Despenser was gone, but his methods survived. The puppet masters who replaced him studied his fall not to avoid tyranny, but to refine it. Meanwhile, abroad, Despenser's execution sent ripples across European courts. Monarchs and ministers, lovers and lackeys took note. The fall of a royal favorite, and especially one so intimately tied to the king, was more than a local drama. It was a warning. Even proximity to power could be fatal when that power turned fragile. Isabella's rebellion became a case study in soft regime change. She had leveraged her role as mother and queen, masked a military invasion as moral correction, and used one man's blood to repaint the entire narrative of English rule. But the spectacle came with a cost. The sheer violence of Despenser's death, his disembowelment, castration, and public humiliation had seared itself into England's political imagination. For centuries afterward, the punishment he endured became the standard for high treason. Hanging, drawing, and quartering were no longer rare judicial anomalies. They became institutionalized acts of horror, ritualized forms of state vengeance. Parliament would later codify these punishments in law, citing Despenser's necessary end as precedent. In this way, Despenser's agony became permanent. More chillingly, the moral rationale for his execution, his rumored sexual relationship with the king, became a tool of political weaponry. Homosexuality, already taboo, was now tied directly to treason. Whispered intimacy became a means to discredit enemies, especially those too close to royal favor. Despenser's legacy wasn't just tyranny, it was a blueprint for how to destroy someone utterly, politically, legally, sexually, and physically. His mutilation was not punishment, it was purification, and it echoed far beyond him. Future royal favorites, from James I's first lover George Villiers to Richard II's confidants, would be haunted by Despenser's name. The tale would be retold whenever a noble climbed too close to the sun. It was invoked not to inspire, but to threaten. Within just 4 years of Despenser's death, a new shift emerged. Edward III, now coming of age, grew wary of his mother and Mortimer's grip and power. He had seen how favorites could rise and fall. In 1330, Edward III staged a surprise coup. Mortimer was arrested and executed. Isabella, though spared, was confined and faded from political life. And so the wheel turned again. Power, paranoia, execution. Despenser had ruled from the shadows, then died in the open. Mortimer ruled in the Queen's bedchamber and met the axe. Each regime repeated the same choreography, as if the kingdom itself had absorbed the lesson. No power lasts unless it is feared. But none would match the raw spectacle of Despenser's downfall. His death, crafted to shock, to sting, to terrify, succeeded too well. It didn't just kill a man, it shifted the emotional grammar of English governance, made cruelty normal, made vengeance acceptable, and made the people not just witnesses, but participants, because they had cheered. In the end, Hugh Despenser wasn't merely executed, he was erased, dismantled, turned into a cautionary tale carved in flesh and fire. His rise was brilliant, his grip absolute, and his fall catastrophic. But the true horror wasn't just in his screams, it was in how quickly a nation learned to cheer them. What does that say about power, about justice, about us? Despenser's story lingers not because of his sins alone, but because of how easily his destruction was repackaged as righteousness. His name became a tool, his mutilation, a model. He became the monster used to justify more monsters. And yet, beneath the tyranny and ambition was a man, flawed, brilliant, consumed. Was he a villain, or simply what happens when loyalty meets unchecked opportunity? Could it happen again? Or worse, has it never stopped? That's the real question. Not just who Hugh Despenser was, but what he revealed about the fragility of kings, the appetite of crowds, and the violence always lurking beneath the pageantry of power. What do you think? Was his punishment justice, or just revenge in royal disguise? Let us know in the comments below and tell us, what historical figure do you want to uncover next? If this story shook you, challenged you, or made you see history differently, subscribe for more tales of ambition, betrayal, and the bloody dance of power. Because behind every crown, there's always a shadow. And sometimes the shadow is darker than the throne.